on the 0 Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We are on the verge of a new season in many ways, more ways than one, of course. As we go to air, it is it's Easter weekend as well as Passover. Both holidays are celebrations of renewal. And we've got a lot going on in the political world, perhaps some early signs of renewal, and certainly many signs that a renewal is needed. So with all that in mind, I welcome my next guest. You know her for her presidential campaign. You know her for her books and her teaching, and now she has a podcast as well. Marianne Williamson, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Welcome back to the 0 Hour.
Thank you, Richard. It's always great to talk to you.
I saw you had tweeted something about the holiday, about Passover and Easter, and that's what inspired me to ask you once again to return, because I feel these are holidays that we almost celebrate robotically, or tend to. We go into them because we're expected to. Everybody takes Easter off. We know we've seen the movies. If we're Jewish, then, as you and I did growing up, we celebrate Passover, but the meanings of the rituals can sometimes, I think, be misunderstood, especially in troubling times. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Do you have, first of all, before we start, you have any thoughts on that in general?
Well, the holidays are supposed to be holy days, but too often in an overly secularized society, everybody would agree it's a secularized society. I would think, as many people do, that it's an overly secularized society. We don't really celebrate so much the holiness of the holidays. You never hear, however, a Jew say, I'm not going to go to Passover Seder this year because I know the story. And you never hear a Christian say, I'm not going to go to Easter service this year because I know the story. The story doesn't change. But we change, we grow. And the opportunity is that every year we approach the story with a greater understanding of how deep the story goes if we bring our depth to it. Now, obviously, the Last Supper was a Passover Seder, and both Passover and Easter denote that even in the most troubled circumstances, symbolized by the slavery of the Israelites, symbolized by Jesus on the cross, God creates an opening that we cannot create for ourselves. There is always a Moses factor, which, of course, is the resurrective factor, where God is present, openings occur that would not otherwise occur. So, it's interesting because something that Judaism has in common with Islam, but which is different than Christianity, is that in both Judaism and in Islam, the history of the people is intimately tied up with the theology. Mm-hmm. So in a country that is so dominated by the Christian religion, there is less of a popular understanding that this applies to nations as much as it applies to individuals.
A lot of great observations there, Marianne, and I want to try to remember them and take them one at a time. First of all, I love what you said about the story. We don't go for this story. I mean, I was picturing somebody, I know how this one ends, right? He dies, he comes back.
Yeah, let's eat.
That's not
they went in Israel, and Moses came, and then they went in the...
I saw this one already.
Okay, let's see.
When I was a kid, I saw this one. So, I love that. So obviously the enactment and the reenactment is meant to infuse us with something, right? Or imbue us with a quality within ourselves. It's not like a story about a person on a cross or an ancient people. In hearing this story and repeating the story, and of course in Judaism, we read the story out loud, and the youngest person asks questions and so on. But in Christianity, there's a lot of reenactment historically of the Stations of the Cross and so on. And in each case, it's about each individual perception of the larger truth that the story holds. And I think that's really important for us to remember. Now, in terms of understanding and internalizing this message, I'm going to get in a little trouble here because, I always thought that Kurt Vonnegut made a great point. In one of his books, he had this fictional alter ego writer, Kilgore Trout. And in one of his books, Kilgore Trout writes a novel based on the premise that the Easter story had it all wrong, that it was too easy to interpret the nature of the Easter story as don't kill somebody you don't know because they might have an important dad. So in his story, in this alternate story, a God comes down and resurrects Barabbas, the man on the next cross, to make the point that it's not who you are. It's the possibility of grace for everyone. And even though, of course, Kurt Vonnegut was a dedicated atheist, a committed atheist, to me, I think he made a beautiful spiritual point. What do you think?
Well, in the Course in Miracles, actually, Jesus says something not different than that about Judas. He said, Judas was my brother who I loved. He was just playing out his part in the story. So I think Vonnegut's Vonnegut point is well taken, that a God of love is a God of love for all beings. But I think, you talk about it being a story. The great religious stories are code. Mm-hmm. They are coded messages. And these messages are as important for us today as at any time. We are not well served by the arrogance of the modern Western mind. We think, we're living at a time where obviously we don't have a handle on evil. Obviously, many of the things that we thought, we can handle, we can manage. Well, how well are you managing when people are walking into grocery stores with assault weapons, when people are walking into church? I mean, how's this going, guys? And yet the resistance, it was not just the resistance of people around Jesus to his message. It's interesting. There was also a great resistance among the Jews when Moses said, okay, we can leave. We got to go quick. But Pharaoh's had it. He said, okay, I've had it. I've had it with the plagues and with the locusts. Okay, take your people and get out of here. Moses goes and he says, okay, we got to go. We got to go fast. And that's, of course, we get the matzah, the unleavened bread, because they had to go so fast. But it's interesting in the story, Richard, because the people were not that excited. People said to Moses, wait a minute, we're slaves, but we're functioning. We can exist. Right. You want us to go into the desert. There are no roads in the desert, Moses. You want us to go to some promised land. You have no idea where it is. And so the resistance of people to salvation, the resistance of people to liberation, the resistance of people to taking another road is as relevant to us today because we have a neoliberal political establishment which has brought us to the brink of catastrophe. The environmental degradation, the corruption of our food supply, the corruption of our water, the unsustainable levels of wealth inequality. There are so many blinking red lights, and look how much resistance people have to saying, you know what, this really is not working on. We need something so radically different. And if ever, and I know this, boy, do I know this, if you want to know what gets rejected first, mocked first, resisted first, try telling people, why don't we try love? Why don't we try God? Why don't we try love? We're reiterating this. All we do is reiterate the old stories.
Boy, do I hear you. I wrote a piece, not to make it about me, Marianne, but I wrote a piece last week called Every Person of Conscience is a Revolutionary Waiting to be Born. And the whole point was that Clinton person that annoys you, that Trump supporter with the MAGA hat, if they have a heart, if they have a soul, and, some people can't access it, but as long as they have a conscience, then with the right information, they can be companions on the road. Boy, I got hate mail over that. That was, people don't, and I'm talking about from pretty much everybody, that people don't want to hear that people are attached to their hatreds, to their divisions, to their tribal affiliations. and they don't want to see a way out of it. And to me, I think your analogy of, the people in slavery saying, well, at least we get 3 square meals a day. It's kind of, it's dusty.
They don't think they got 3 square meals a day.
Well, whatever they got, they were surviving.
They were surviving.
And the point is, we endure certain forms, not as strict, but certain forms of slavery today and restriction, and it's scary. The unknown is scary.
The unknown is scary. And also what you're saying, though, is so true. I was looking at some people who said to me or about me on the internet the other day, she's not an ally. Like, the world for some people is divided into allies and not allies. Now, you can't even say anymore, I disagree with you. It's now, no, you're wrong. If you don't see it the way I do, you're wrong. So even though people on the right so often stand for a mean-spiritedness in policy, so many people on the left seem to have no problem with a mean-spiritedness of personal attitude towards those who disagree with us in even the most nuanced way. Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. So, and of course, according to the philosophy of nonviolence, self-purification precedes direct political activism. So this idea of purifying our own hearts of lack of love is as important as purifying our policies of lack of love.
I think that's incredibly true, actually, Marianne Williamson, and it's almost become sort of a refrain. Matt Taibbi is a regular guest on this show, for example. A lot of people making this complaint about the left, and then there's a counter complaint, well, you're not really focusing on the important things. But to me, there is a tendency across the political spectrum. There are the Robespierres as well as the Judge Roy Beans, whether you're right or left, whatever your background, that we need to overcome this human struggle to say, I'm right, you're wrong, and my ability to condemn you gives me such a personal satisfaction. And I think there's a widespread disease on the left. I'm so addicted to being able to tell you, Marianne Williamson, you're not a good ally. That feels so good to me. I get such an endorphin rush.
I don't trust her. She's not a perfect ally.
Yeah, it's an addiction, Marianne. To me, it is an addiction to conflict, to judgment, to a division. And my little piece, my little essay was an attempt to say this division stuff isn't helping anybody, but people don't want their addictions. We know that you and I know that people don't like to have their addictions taken away from them. The first time the subject comes up, you get a pretty negative response a lot of the time. But I think that the left, as well as the right and the center, has an addiction to dividing, ourselves and others and creating conflict out of that. I think that's a fuel for destruction.
Well, what you are referring to in as an addiction is what in the story of Passover is referred to as the slavery of the Israelites by Pharaoh. That's what addiction is. It's being enslaved to a craving, enslaved to a pattern of behavior that is obsessive and addictive. And of course, that addiction is also what the crucifixion is. So when you look deeper than the addiction, it's the issue of a counterforce to love. You can call it Satan, you can call it the devil, you can call it the shadow. It doesn't matter what we call it, but it is an idea that, once again, going back to the arrogance of the Western modern mind, we have in our naivete that we have thought was our sophistication, thought that we didn't have to worry about that. I remember many years ago saying to myself, Marianne, you don't not have to worry about the devil. That's all in your head. And then I realized that that's the worst place it could possibly be. The fact that there is in our head, it is in our head, and you can call it addiction, you can call but the addiction itself comes from that counterforce to love. And when we see our people's resistance to it, I saw it, I've had a lot of time to think about my presidential campaign, Richard, and the illogical, irrational animus towards someone who dared to say, why don't we put love of the children first, and love of the poor, and love of the earth, and like it is the height of stupidity. It is the height of ridiculousness. It is a height of lack of sophistication. And then you say, well, no, wait a minute, here are all these policy prescriptions that define that. The anger at it, the animus thrown at it, like you said, from the left. Like, whoa, isn't that interesting?
You know, and again, Marianne Williamson, this whole, people are so uncomfortable talking about love.
Now, I'm sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Well,
Maybe I missed your point.
Yeah, my brother, who's a big lefty like we are, he called me one day, and this I do understand. He said, Marianne, I know a lot of my friends who actually are your supporters, and they want to. He said, but men, we don't have can you just use another word? He said, men don't have an easy time. Just use another word but love. And I heard that too, and I do hear that. But this was a reaction to the whole idea that there is some internal aspect, some internal dimension to societal transformation. Once again, going back to the fact it wasn't just one man on the cross. In the Passover story, it's the whole nation. And Islam has that too. The idea that you cannot separate the principles of God from the life of the nation, which is why I feel strongly about reparations. The idea of atonement and amends applies as much to a national identity. Just like a person can't move forward without cleaning up the past, a country can't move forward without cleaning up the past. And the thing that strikes me, and that I talked about quite a bit on the campaign, is that to submit this is simply 21st century thinking. You know, you have Harvard Medical School with symposiums on integrative medicine. You have business conferences where CEOs are doing meditation classes. You have educational conferences where they talk about the whole child. The idea that there is an internal as well as external aspect to being human, and that any fundamental change must include that which addresses the internal as well as the external factors. American politics is the only corner of our culture that hasn't gotten the memo yet. It's stuck back in this, it's sort of the 1990s, sort of. It projects onto anybody who brings a whole person perspective, like we're fringe. No, you're fringe. And your conversation is so much about symptoms and not about cause. So much not about root problems, that you are an inadequate container for the kind of problem-solving energies that we need in this country right now. And we must change this. We don't have time to tarry. We must change this, Richard, or I don't know how our democracy will survive.
Well, that's why the show is called The 0 Hour, Marianne, because, you know, we're out of time. This is it. And to me, you know, where the word love comes in is the discomfort. If you look at the sweep of human history, to me, the revulsion almost that people have to that word in the political sphere, to me, is a sign of a deep dysfunction, societal dysfunction, the alienation from the heart, you know, kind of.
Well, also, though, if it's somebody speaking of it within a specifically religious context, and particularly if it's a man, the system allows it. A woman saying it, the misogyny is so deep. I can say something that Martin Luther King said, or the Reverend Barber said, and Martin Luther King says it, or even Cory Booker, and it's like, thank you, Reverend. I say it, and it's New Age woo-woo. There's a reason for that, because it has to be within the sanctioned boxes. Mm-hmm. So if you're within the sanctioned box, then it's okay. It's when it's not within the box, when it's under nobody's control, when it's under no paternalistic control, that's when it's considered something that must be suppressed.
And to me, one of the key words of what you just said is paternalistic. That when it comes out from a woman, from a powerful woman, then it's like, oh, wow, let's not get carried away here with this stuff. And to me, and the other side of it, I think, is we have such a conformist political culture right now.
Oh, unbelievable.
So nobody wants to kind of step out of the box of what you're allowed to say, not just in terms of the Overton window of left versus right, but I would say, the other dimensions of, spirit, heart, whatever. And if you step out of that, everybody's afraid they'll make fun of you. And Trump stepped out of it in the negative way, and everybody made fun of him, but he became president for 4 years.
I think that this is such an important thing that you're talking about, because I'm thinking about this so much. So you have this, as you know, I don't need to tell you, we have this corporatist duopoly. And people are afraid that if they get outside the box, that is the sanctioned corporatist, that which is basically sanctioned by the corporatist agenda within both Democrats and Republicans, they're afraid they'll have no power. And I understand how they exile you. I understand the character assassination they employ. I understand that. But I still think, it's so interesting, Richard. One of the things I saw when I was running was, even though I saw the corruption of the system, I saw the intelligence of the voters, the decency of the voters, the dignity of the voters. And if you look at the largest political denomination right now, it's independent. There is a rising tide of people saying, pox on both your houses, because there are so many people who realize the conversation we need to be having is not sanctioned by the people who created the frickin' problem. That's what's so outrageous here. We are looking to people who created the problem to be the problem solvers. The conversation they're having will not solve the problem because the status quo does not disrupt itself. Now, this carries great risk, though, because none of us want to be Jill Stein either. None of us want to, and I don't mean that personally about her.
Of course.
Yeah. None of us want to, oh my God, could I do something that would help the Republicans? But that's the explosion that's coming up. That's the volcanic surge that I think is going to define a lot of what happens over the next few years. People know that the corporatist ideology within the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, especially not only seeing what they did to Bernie for two times in a row, but also seeing what's happening even now, the suppression of a real progressive agenda. Something's going to give. Something's got to give. It can't continue like this.
Well, I read a political science paper a while back. I think it was published at the end of 2019. I'd love to see an update surveying the USA and Western Europe, and basically showing that enormous percentages of the population, of maybe 40% of the voting population, is filled with enormous anger at elites. And that, in the words of the political scientists who did the study, they want to burn down the democratic small d cosmos, meaning this is an entire universe we've created, a political universe, and they want nothing to do with it. They think it's, and they're right in the sense that it has screwed them, oppressed them, ruined them. So there's this explosive energy. And, Trump, to me, was just a warning signal of what could come later.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the impulse to bring in someone who would just burn the house down was not of itself illegitimate. It's just that we brought in the biggest arsonists. He was not a constructive force, to say the least.
Right, and he was not really interested in replacing the house with something better. He was really part of the house. So where do you think this leads us? Here we are. It's Passover. It's Easter. It's both those holidays, obviously, in one way or another, have their origins in renewal and spring and, what. How as a society, I'd love to say, okay, great, it's going to be spring again. We've got Democrats in control of the Senate and you know where I'm going, right? In control of the Senate and House. We got a Democratic president. But to me, it's, I feel dread for the winter of 2022 for sure. And I feel, yes, but, Biden's doing some good things. Just as you and I were in indentured servitude, there was one boss who was like, gave you a lunch break and one who didn't. I'd rather have the one who gives you a lunch break, but indentured servitude is bad. And I feel as if we have a social order that just can't last. It's going to collapse one way or another.
It is going to collapse. Well, what we need is a miracle. That's what what the story of Passover is the Jews say we don't believe in miracles, but we rely upon them. The whole idea of intercessionary power is that you consider the possibility there might be another way. If you look at the American political system and what's happening with our democracy and on our planet, only from a rationalistic perspective, the gig is up. Our topsoil won't even last for another 60 years.
Right.
If you look at this only from a rationalistic, materially based perspective, but it is reasonable to assume humanity will not continue to exist. The species will not survive the 21st century, and the ecosystem will completely implode. And what comes first, who knows? It could be weather, it could be biochemical disaster, it could be nuclear, but we are on a trajectory to global destruction if this trajectory is not interrupted with vigor, with force, with fervor, and with passion. Now, the idea of Passover, the idea of the miracle is you consider the possibility there might be another way. It's no different. You talk a lot about the 12 steps. We need to stop thinking we can manage it. Can the Republicans manage it? Can the Democrats manage it? It cannot be managed. Our country has become unmanageable. That's the first step. That's where it all begins. And then you consider the possibility that God can do for you what you cannot do for yourself. You know, one of the things that I think we all do well to remember, the abolitionist movement, Richard, emerged from the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Many of the women who were head of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. And Dr. King, thank you, was a Baptist preacher. Most of the great social justice movements in this country emerged from a religious and spiritual sensibility, embodied by people who thought, well, it's not reasonable to think I can abolish slavery. It's not reasonable to think I can undo the institutionalized suppression of women. It's not reasonable to think we can desegregate the American South, but we're standing on a possibility, faith in those things as yet unseen. And that is what Passover is. That is what Easter is, which is something could happen here beyond what you even know, where there is a level of reverence, devotion, love, and forgiveness.
You know, Gandhi and Malcolm X also coming out of a spiritual tradition. There's
well, of course, Gandhi was the one who articulated this idea of nonviolence and love and spirit within us as a political and economic as well as personal transformative force. And then Dr. King brought it to the United States for application of the civil rights movement. So this idea of putting it down, like it's or even acting like it's some new idea. And not only is it not a new idea, the two greatest political movements of the 20th century, the removal of the British colonial empire from India and the civil rights movement in the United States, were both based on nonviolent spiritual political philosophy.
There's a great moment in the Gandhi movie, I haven't been able to confirm whether it actually happened, but where a general says to him, you know, in the beginning when he starts leading the movement, the whole idea of the British leaving India is just preposterous. I mean, to your point, it's just ridiculous. And one of the generals says to him at one point, says to Gandhi, what, do you think we're just going to get up and leave? And Gandhi says, yes. In the end,
and that is true. And it was Mountbatten. It's a famous line. It was Mountbatten.
Oh, is it? Okay.
And you think we're going to just leave India? And he said, yeah.
Yes, you're just going to leave. Yeah. And that is satyagraha, as he said. He had that momentum with him. And by the way, speaking of Passover, there was something that always bothered me. I was raised in Judaism as a kid. And there was something that always bothered me about the Passover ritual, and that's the 10 plagues and the death of the firstborn. It always seemed to me, you know, I always used to think as a child, those babies didn't do anything. You know, why would you kill them? And the only way I've made my peace with it as an adult is by thinking that it's a metaphor, that in fact, going back to addiction, that if you enslave others, you enslave yourself, and the fruits of your soul, of your mind, of your spirit will die, will be stillborn. That, you know, you can't produce anything of beauty or value.
And your family system.
Yeah.
Hello, your kids are going to inherit this poison and this dysfunction.
Right. So we have to hope that soul force takes over, or we're going to be in for.
If I may.
Of course.
Passover and Easter are not just about hoping, it's about knowing. There's something take something like Easter Sunday, billions of people around the world will be joined in the thought that something else is possible. That reverberates. There's a field of possibility. An idea grows stronger when more people share it.
Oh, absolutely.
So this idea of people joining in religious and spiritual sensibility is a very real and important antidote to how many people are joined now in sensibilities of hatred, mean-spiritedness, bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, homophobia. This is a serious thing to create a field of energy that is an antidote to those things. Those things are collectivized hatred, and now we need collectivized love.
And the collectivization goes back to, we've gone so deeply into an age of individuality and
and people talk about, people say small random acts of kindness. Small and random acts of kindness are not enough. We need huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. So you look at the environmentalist movement, we need a food movement. We need a new peace movement. We need a children's movement. We need we need to be thinking more. Richard, I want to ask you this. This is an interesting one for me. Does it seem to you, and it's so interesting with what's happening in Alabama with Amazon and union. Right. Isn't it interesting that unions are becoming cool again?
Well,
you've got a whole younger generation who gets it. Unions. I mean, for a long time there, the right wing had been so successful at just marginalizing the whole union conversation, and now it's like up and center and young people getting it, and very hopeful sign.
It's a tremendously hopeful sign, and to me it speaks to that reassertion of communal power.
Thank you. Reassertion of communal power. Exactly. I love that. Reassertion. Might have to quote you on that, Richard RJ Eskow. Reassertion of communal power.
That is, to me, the mission statement. Yeah, right there. Mm-hmm. So, Marianne Williamson, here we are. We're at the on the cusp of these, or in the midst of these holidays of renewal. Any closing thoughts for us before I let you go?
Yeah, my closing thought has to do with the symbolic meaning of the 40 years between slavery and deliverance into the Promised Land, and the symbolic 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection. And that's that when your consciousness changes, it still takes time within the material world to work out the transition. Mm-hmm. But it's very important to know what's happening. It'll take a little time. But during that time, my friend Sandy used to call it tomb time. And I think that it's important for us to realize that once the idea is conceived by enough people, social movements work much like pregnancy in a woman's body. First, there's a conception, but then there's the gestation before there is labor and delivery. And I think that something is gestating right now. Something is gestating. And this fervor for communal activism, etc. And this is the time for faith. Faith, not that it's going to be done for us, but it will be done through us to the extent to which we stand on the possibility. Abolitionists had no way of knowing if it could work. Women suffragettes had no way of knowing if it could work. Civil rights movements had no way of knowing it would work. And yet, like Gandhi saying, yes, we do know it will work, partly because of those coded stories and promises, such as Passover and Easter. It might take a little bit longer than we thought. And none of that is to say, it's like when my environmentalist friends will say to me, don't worry about the planet, Marianne, it'll be okay. It just might have to kick off this predatory human species for a few 100,000 years. Well, we have to see that as a completely unacceptable and intolerable option, given the immeasurable amount of human and other species suffering that would cause. We can claim, no, it's going to happen, maybe not in our lifetime, but before complete global catastrophe. And if enough of us go into that place in our consciousness and then stand on it in whatever way that means, in terms of our political and social activism, as well as our own self-purification processes, we're going to have an American miracle. There have been plenty of American miracles before. The abolition of slavery was, the women's suffragette movement, the civil rights movement. I agree with Joe Biden on that one. God knows Americans down. We're in decline. We're in the pit, but we've come up from pits before, and I think this is a good week to celebrate the fact that God specializes in new beginnings.
And maybe the next time around, we won't have to be an empire anymore. We'll just be people setting an example and living together.
Well, until humanity becomes an enlightened species, there will always be something. But even if we can't, create total enlightenment, we can certainly create a lot more mercy, a lot more justice than there is now.
And on that note, Marianne Williamson, as always, a great delight to speak with you. And as always, thank you for coming on the program.
Oh, right back at you. Great respect, great admiration. Love you. Thank you.
Love you too. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.